Well, Nat Turner's revolt was the big event of 1831 in the South, and it just totally altered the sort of the consensus that existed before then, that I talked about as the sort of the 1810s, 1820s comfort zone. That's going to end. It didn't happen immediately, it didn't happen overnight, but as time goes on, it became more and more intense in the South that we cannot accept any limitation of slavery, and the idea of abolishing slavery is totally unacceptable for no other reason than that will expose us to death at the hands of slaves like Nat Turner. Well, in the North, the big event of 1831 actually took place in Boston, when a local man named William Lloyd Garrison started publishing a magazine called The Liberator. The Liberator, starting with the first issue actually in January of 1831. And Garrison attacked slavery. Well, I've told you, we've talked about this at some length. There have always been anti-slavery people in America. But Garrison was different. Garrison said, slavery is wrong. It is immoral. It is contrary to the teachings of Christianity. It is totally unacceptable. He said, we need to abolish slavery, period. These other two concerns that have always held up the anti-slavery people, that have always put them into a sort of difficult position that they couldn't figure out what to do with, he said, those don't matter. If we abolish slavery, it doesn't matter what happens to the slaves. It's not an issue. We don't care about that. What'll happen will happen. I don't care. Doesn't matter. We just have to abolish slavery. Period. No objections, no questions, no modifications, no wimping out on it and say, oh, but we've got to figure out some way to deal with the slaves. We've got to figure out some way to get them to Africa or something like that. I don't care. We just have to abolish slavery. Slavery is a total abomination in the eyes of the Lord, and it has to be abolished. End of story. He accompanied this with many attacks on slaveholders as immoral people. And some of it was very direct. He accused slaveholders, with some accuracy, of having engaged in sexual activities with many of their slave females. It was well known and sort of understood that many slave owners looked upon their female slaves as their useful for sexual purposes. In God's eyes, that's adultery. And so Garrison didn't hesitate to bring that up and to say that slavery simply encouraged and accepted adultery, which is a sin. Slave owners in general were sinners. They're not just people who have a different view of things. They're sinners. They're wrong. They're evil. So he attacked them very strenuously in very direct, very emotional language. And he also attacked the idea that they were property. They are human beings. They cannot be property. When people suggested to him that, wait a minute, the Constitution protects property rights. Slaves are property. You can't get rid of slavery because you can't take away the property of slaves. And that's protected by the Constitution. And Garrison's reply was, if the Constitution supports slavery, then I say, I don't accept the Constitution. And he would carry on. He would give speeches in which he would hold up a copy of the Constitution, and he would say, this is the Constitution. If it protects slavery, then I say, get rid of it. And he would set it on fire. He would light a match or whatever and burn the Constitution in front of his audience. You know, he's burning the Constitution. I mean, that's the Constitution. And he says, if it supports slavery, it's wrong. He was just extreme in his opposition. See, and so this makes him, and we'll call him an abolitionist, different from the the earlier anti-slavery people who had always sort of kind of hemmed and hawed and said, yeah, we can't really do it because what are we going to do about the slaves, and we can't just take away the property of the slave owners. And he just said, I don't care about either of those. We've got to get rid of slavery. Now, when he started out, he was just a single person, and of course he was hated. He was denounced because, I mean, he's criticizing the Constitution, and he's criticizing property rights. You know, America is based on the idea that all men are created equal, yes. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, yes. That among those are life, liberty, and property, yes. Property, that means slaves, that people have their slaves. The Constitution, the American system, protects slavery. And Garrison said, no, it doesn't. I mean, he's assaulting one of the holy of holies. He's assaulting property rights. I mean, why did Americans become revolutionaries? Why did we become independent? Because England was taking away our property rights with the Stamp Act and other measures that we went out and revolted against. To a great extent, America is based on protecting property rights. And slaves are property. So America protects slavery. And Garrison was rejecting that. He's saying, I don't care about that. And here's your damn Constitution. I'm going to set it on fire. So he was very much opposed. He was hated. Southerners held him up as an example of how terrible Northerners were. They were terrified by his literature. The South, certainly as part of their clampdown on slavery, prohibited any distribution of abolitionist literature in the South. It became a crime in the South to own that, or to try to bring it in, or try to sell it, or to send it in the mail. The South became a police state with patrols wandering the streets or the roads looking for slaves who might not be on their plantation, and might be runaways or whatever, might be potential followers of Nat Turner. And then added to that, they were restricting any kind of freedom of speech by prohibiting any kind of abolitionist literature from ever appearing in the place. They don't want anybody to read that, especially they're afraid that some of that abolitionist literature might fall into the hands of, God help us, slaves. So there's tremendous opposition to Garrison and to abolitionists. As time went on, though, more and more Northerners accepted the abolitionist position. Abolitionism became more and more acceptable. It was tied to certain other reform movements of the 1830s and early 1840s. Many women who were advocating for women's rights also advocated for anti-slavery, seeing that both women and slaves were being oppressed by white males. There are certain evangelical Christian movements that also endorsed abolitionism. Garrison was profoundly Christian, and his opposition was strongly based in Christian faith. And so There are a lot of evangelical Christian movements that are new and starting up, and they also embraced abolitionism as part of their whole effort to reshape America into a more Christian community. Christianity and slavery were viewed as incompatible. There were other newspapers that started to appear. There were abolitionist organizations established in many northern towns. They were always very much opposed. They were hated by mainstream America. They were considered extremists and unworthy of America. There are a couple of incidents that are revealing about mainstream America's rejection of abolitionism. In Philadelphia, the organization, the abolitionist organizations there were having trouble finding a place where they could hold their meetings. There are a number of buildings in Philadelphia that are for rent for, it's just like today, where if you want to have a big function, you can go to some gym or something like that, or there are places that are home to meetings and they'll rent out rooms or buildings, whatever, for that. But none of them would rent to the abolitionists. They would, those were considered too extreme, too radical, too unacceptable. So abolitionists couldn't hold any meetings because they couldn't find a place that would rent to them. So they decided to build their own. They raised some money, they bought some land, they hired an architect, whatever, and they built a building as a home for their meetings. This is a meeting hall that they could use regularly whenever they wanted to have a meeting. And the building opened. 2 days later, a mob in Philadelphia attacked the building, destroyed it, and that was the end of that. Mob violence directed against abolitionism. In northern Illinois, there was a newspaper publisher, and he was an abolitionist newspaper man. In 1837, a mob stormed into his newspaper plant, punished it, destroyed it, and executed him. I mean, there's mob violence against the abolitionists. Most Northerners could not and would not accept abolitionism. They continued to resist it, oftentimes with violence. But slowly but surely, abolitionism gained strength. It gained more and more supporters, partly because of religious belief. Christianity played a key role in the greater and greater acceptance of abolitionism. And then there were just many, many Americans who accepted the idea that we all have basic natural rights and that all men are created equal, and that included African American men as well as white men. So there's just a sort of a gradual, slow but steady increase in support for abolitionism. Now, I'm not going to get this far in the class, but just to go ahead to 1860, I will tell you, this is would be, if I'd had more time, and if I'd done a better job of managing my lectures and not spent so much time on things that I like to talk about, if we'd gotten up to 1860, by that time, of course, we're going to have, the war is going to begin. But even in 1860, most Americans, most Northerners, still rejected abolitionism. They still regarded it as too extreme, too radical, and it could not be accepted. And if I'd been able to talk about Abraham Lincoln, I would have told you that even in 1860, even Abraham Lincoln went to great lengths to deny that he was an abolitionist. That was like saying, it's like today when the Republicans accuse Democrats of being socialists. That's like a bad word, socialist, abolitionist. whatever. In my day, it was communist, whatever, whatever, whatever. And being an abolitionist was a politically unacceptable. And so Lincoln, as a very careful politician, made sure that he clarified he was not an abolitionist. He was, and we'll talk about what he was and his position, or at least I'll maybe get to it. But 1860, even then, although the abolitionists have made a lot of gains, they still were considered too radical for mainstream America, too extreme. Even, they over 30 years from 1831 to 1861, they got more and more strength. But even by 1861, yeah, they're much. When they started, it's a tiny fraction, two guys in Boston or whatever. By 1861, they're a significant minority, but they're still a minority. And one of the things that they managed to do as part of their success was to have many northern states pass state laws that were called personal liberty laws. Personal liberty laws. And they varied greatly from state to state. But what they dealt with was the issue of runaway slaves. Now, I've talked about slave resistance, and I've talked about low-key resistance and then the extreme of leading a rebellion. Well, probably the most common form of resistance, or at least the most drastic form of resistance, that other than the extreme of an outright rebellion, which took place only a couple of times and in which everybody was killed. But another form of resistance to slavery that I may have mentioned, but was just to run away. Runaways became very common. That had always been one of the drawbacks to slavery, one of the problems for slave owners, had always been runaway slaves. Well, as time went on, runaway slaves became more and more common. It became more and more of a problem for owners to have their slaves be running away so frequently and so far. If you could keep a slave in the South, there's a whole structure of local government, county sheriffs, law enforcement officers designed to help catch and return runaway slaves. One of the main activities of law enforcement in the South was catching and returning runaway slaves. One of the biggest industries in the South was slave catching. There were a lot of people who went into business working, setting up a business and contracting out to owners who'd had a slave run away, and for a fee going out and finding and catching and returning that slave to the owner. So there's a whole, there's local government, and there are private entrepreneurs involved in the business of catching and returning runaway slaves. And in the South, they cooperated. A private slave catcher could count on working with the local sheriff. What you do is you go into town and say, hey, sheriff, you find any slaves here that you don't know about, that are just new, that don't seem to be locals? And just generally work with local law enforcement. You could find that they would help you with your work of catching slaves. And you could put your slave into a jail if you caught one and hold him there, and the county would keep the jail, the slave for you, and then you could spend the night in a hotel, and the next day you could go out and start the process of taking your slave back to his master. And it might take several days, and everywhere you went along the way, you would deposit the slave in a local jail, and the local sheriff would help you by keeping track of him for you overnight, so you could go out and get a night's sleep. And that was in the South. The North was a different story.